When my daughter collapsed on my doorstep, bruised and shaking, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just opened the door wider and said, "Get inside before the neighbors see." Before I begin, please support me by subscribing and liking this video. It helps me share more stories like mine. She stumbled past me, clutching her arm like it might fall off. Her hair was wet from the rain, her lipstick smeared, her eyes wide and empty. I'd seen that look before, on other women, in other houses, but never on my own child. Her name is Olivia, 26, smart, a lawyer, stubborn as hell. She'd married a man named Dean Marshall 2 years ago. On paper, he was perfect. Wealthy family, nice suits, big smile. I never liked him. His handshake was too soft, and his compliments were too rehearsed. That night, when she fell into my arms, I finally understood why. I took her to the kitchen, sat her down, and turned on the light. The bruise on her cheekbone looked fresh, purple creeping toward blue. "Who did this?" I asked, though I already knew. She said nothing, just stared at her hands. I poured her coffee. "You can talk, or you can sit there. Either way, I'm calling it in." Her head snapped up. "No, Mom, please don't." That word, please, cut deeper than anything. I've been on the force 29 years. I've seen what happens when people don't report the first hit. It becomes the second, then the third, then a body. "He's dangerous," she whispered finally. "And he's not alone." That part stuck with me. Not alone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with my badge on the table, my gun beside it, and Olivia asleep upstairs. I kept hearing her words, "Not alone." By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to rush in and arrest him like a rookie. No. If Dean Marshall was smart enough to hide his bruises behind bank accounts and lawyers, I'd take him apart the same way. At 8 a.m., I called in sick, the first time in years. Then I drove to Olivia's house. The driveway was empty. No cars, no neighbors outside. I walked straight to the door, used the spare key she'd given me years ago, just in case. Inside, everything looked expensive and lifeless. Polished marble, glass tables, the kind of place that photographs well but doesn't feel lived in. There was a faint smell of whiskey and something metallic. I opened the dishwasher. Empty. Trash can. Empty. He'd cleaned up, but he'd missed something. In the hallway, a frame had fallen. The photo inside showed them at some charity gala. His hand was on her waist. Her smile looked practiced. Behind the glass, a crack ran right through his face. I kept staring at it, realizing how symbolic it was. Then I saw the paper tucked behind the frame, folded, torn at the edge. I pulled it out. It was a bank statement. Her account. Over $200,000 missing in withdrawals over the last 6 months. Transfers to an account under M&R Holdings, LLC. That name sounded familiar. I'd seen it on a report a few years back. Fraud, shell corporations, offshore laundering. The case had been buried. I called an old friend in financial crimes. "Jack, it's me." "Ruth? Jesus, it's been forever. What's up? You ever heard of M&R Holdings?" A pause. Then, "Yeah, stay away from that mess." Too late. He sighed. "That's Dean Marshall's company. At least one of them. He's been under quiet investigation for inheritance fraud. His father's estate, missing millions. Can't prove it yet." I hung up. My stomach went cold. When I got home, Olivia was awake, sitting at the kitchen table staring at her phone. "He called," she said. "He wants to meet. Said he'll make it right." "Where?" "The cabin. The one near Ridgefield. I knew that place. His father's old hunting cabin. Isolated, no signal, no witnesses." "You're not going," I said. She looked at me, her voice trembling. "If I don't, he'll come here." That's when I realized this wasn't just a domestic dispute. It was leverage. She had something he wanted, something he was willing to break her for. So, I made a plan. That night, I drove to the cabin an hour before the meeting, parked a quarter-mile out, checked my weapon, turned on my body cam. The rain had started again, a steady hiss on the trees. The cabin light was on. Through the window, I saw him pacing, phone in hand. Sharp suit even out here. I stayed low, watching. Then another car pulled up. A man stepped out. Not Olivia. It was Deputy Owen, one of ours. I froze. They shook hands. Dean handed him a thick envelope. Owen nodded. My chest tightened. That's when I understood just how deep it went. When Olivia's car finally arrived, I waited until she stepped out before moving. My gun stayed holstered. I wasn't here for blood. I just needed the truth. Dean grabbed her arm the moment she entered. His voice carried through the night air. You think you can steal from me and walk away? I didn't steal anything, she cried. He slammed a folder on the table. Then explain this. I took a photo through the window. A stack of documents, inheritance transfers, signatures, false trusts. Olivia gasped. That's your handwriting! He leaned in close. Prove it. I recorded everything. Every word. Every threat. Then I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned. Owen stood there, gun drawn. Put it down, Ruth, he said. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you, I said. She's lying to you. You don't know what she's into. I stepped closer. You're on his payroll, Owen. I've got you on camera. He hesitated. That's when Dean shouted from inside. Owen, get her out of here. Owen looked torn. Then, from behind him, another pair of headlights flashed through the trees. Back up. Jack. My call from earlier had gone through after all. In seconds, the scene changed. Dean ran. Owen froze. Jack's team swarmed the cabin. They caught him trying to burn documents in the fireplace. Olivia ran into my arms, sobbing. I held her tight and whispered, It's over. But I knew it wasn't. Not yet. Because when they searched the files, what they found wasn't just fraud. It was names, judges, cops, local officials. Half the town. Dean Marshall wasn't a man. He was a system, and I had just kicked the first brick out of its foundation. He vanished into the trees before I could shout his name. But I already had the proof. Before I keep going, hit subscribe and like this video. It helps me keep telling stories like this. I don't do rules when the rules are part of the crime. That's how I thought when I climbed out of the brush and walked toward that cabin. Jack's team wrapping up like they'd just closed an ordinary burglary. They didn't see the list. They didn't see the ledger tucked under Dean's Bible. The one with names and numbers and quiet notations about transfers and arrangements. They processed what was easy. A check on the books, a few arrests, a handful of corrupt badges on a list. They didn't read the part where the uglier engine of it all throbbed. Threats, smears, property seizures. People ruined so quietly, the town forgot they'd ever been whole. I watched the uniforms move and I felt that particular terrible twitch that comes from knowing your job can't reach far enough. The legal team was by the book, and the book had holes big enough to drive trucks through. Dean had used the book to build his house. That meant the book wasn't going to bury him. Not fully. Not the way I wanted. So I put my badge in the glove compartment of my car, turned off the overhead light, and decided I'd be a different kind of law for a while. Going rogue doesn't mean chaos. It means precision. It means picking what the law can't touch and turning it into leverage the law will have to respect. That's what I told myself as I drove home. Olivia asleep in the passenger seat, bandaged if not clean, from her wounds. She gripped my hand at red lights like she was scared to let go. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the road and my mind on the ledger. First thing, protect Olivia. Not with a restraining order that would take weeks. Protect with facts they couldn't burn. I had to get copies of Dean's company's files. The Shell LLCs, the property transfers. I knew where some of them lived on paper because these men are arrogant. They use their names on stamps and then pat themselves on the back for being clever. But I wouldn't be clever in the same way. Clever for me was ugly and patient and illegal in the fine print sense. It was the kind of clever that leaves you with your name intact but the target exposed. I went back to the Marshall estate during the day. The police had blocked the driveway for evidence collection, but a lot of people doesn't mean everyone. Contractors, assistants, low-paid help. They move through the back. They leave doors ajar. They smoke and gossip. I became a shadow with a badge number in my pocket and a permission to be where I wasn't supposed to be. I sat in my car and watched patterns. The landscaper who delivered twice a week. The courier who always left a large envelope by the gardener's shed. The house manager who took the same route to the garage. Things that seem insignificant look like breadcrumbs after you chase them for 3 days. I started small. I spoke to people like a neighbor. I bought coffee for the landscaper and listened to the kind of talk people give when they think a woman with a car and a checkbook is only interested in gossip. "He's been nervous," the kid said, wiping his hands. "Paying in cash a lot lately. Folks been asking him questions. Not much, not enough, but enough to know fear was leaking through the concrete. Fear gets sloppy. Sloppy makes mistakes. Mistakes leave tracks. Next, I needed to buy time and distance for the paperwork to be copied and moved. I called in favors. I made promises I knew I couldn't keep in the light of day, but that I could in the dark, where a mother's rage blurs the lines. I called men I'd arrested years ago and men I'd helped. I called journalists with sore teeth for a scandal. I offered them truth if they'd hold their mouths open for a second while I pushed the needle. A few took the bait. Some scoffed. People underestimate the hunger for a story with legs. Meanwhile, Dean made moves. You could feel it. Calls at odd hours. A parade of visitors. The short, sharp visits by men who smile too much. Some of them were lawyers. Others were men whose money comes from silence and the kind of deals that don't justify paper. I watched them come and I watched them leave, always careful never to be in the same room when they did. That's how I learned a truth. Dean wasn't the crown. He was the mouthpiece of a larger set of arrangements. You pull at the mouthpiece, you don't always get the teeth. You get the whole jaw moving. When the DA's office wanted to move an indictment, I followed the paperwork. I read depositions and subpoena returns with the kind of hunger you only get when your child's life is on the line. The DA was good, but he was compromised by relationships I could name yet couldn't prove. When you run into men who are raised to give favors to each other, facts become inconvenient. I learned that the better way was to make the inconvenient fact blow up a desk at 3 a.m. in a way that required a public explanation, and public explanations are messy for people who prefer the quiet. So I made a list of targets. The crooked deputy I'd seen at the cabin, the judge who'd always dismissed a certain line of evidence, and Dean's collection of shell entities. The ledger I'd photographed had that list. I also found a pattern in it. A recurring vendor, a trust fund labeled for M&R Holdings Charitable Works. Charitable Works is a shield in this town. Nobody asked because they're suddenly made to feel virtuous. I called an IRS friend and asked for a look. No legal request, just a nudge. He was old and tired and owed me one. He said quietly, "Ruth, you're playing with fire." I told him, "So am I." I took the ledger to a reporter with teeth. I didn't take the ledger to the DA first, because the DA could be bought in ways a reporter can't be. Reporters make noise. Noise rules the day in a small town. It robs men of cover. I left copies in 2 places, encrypted files on safe clouds, and a paper trail to the reporter who'd been looking for the story of her career. Her name is Lena Cruz. She has a half-broken camera and a moral compass she polished every morning. She read the ledger, and her face went hard. "You understand this will ruin people," she said. "You understand how far this goes." I said, "I understand that if it doesn't get out, he'll destroy Olivia, and then move on." She nodded. She said, "Get me the rest." That's when the threat started in earnest. Not with baseball bats, with quiet things. My mailbox was full of flyers from politically neutral PACs supporting the sheriff's loss of funding. My kids found their names run in op-eds. Someone posted a fake account blaming me for a miscarriage of justice years ago. My phone rang, once at 2 a.m. A voice with heavy breathing, and a phrase I'd heard before. "Stay out of it, old lady." I saved the number and fed the audio to Lena. She smiled like a woman who'd witnessed bravery and planned to expose it. Going rogue means you accept the consequences. It also means you choose the battlefield. I chose to hit them where they were thin, reputation, money channels. The quiet ties of trust these people used as ropes. I launched a legal offensive. Not for arrests at first, but for subpoenas that would pry open safe boxes and directories. I threatened the things they loved. Exposure, the disruption of the comfortable. That's when Dean brought in a different class of bully. Lawyers with threats folded like crisp money. They sent letters to Olivia accusing her of embezzlement. They filed for a restraining order against me, claiming harassment. A judge who used to go to the same country club as Dean signed it in a day. I kept a copy. I used the signature later. I won't lie. Being outside the law felt like standing on the edge of an icy lake. I broke things I later had to pick up. I followed men and recorded conversations. But I didn't give you how. I won't tell you how to plant a recorder or how to slip into an office unnoticed. I'll tell you what mattered. The content. When Dean spoke to Owen in that dim motel room and said, "Make sure the next deposit clears," and Owen answered, "Already on it," I didn't need to know what route the money would take. I needed the proof that the hand that managed funds was the same hand moving death and fear. That voice, that exchange, held power. The town hated me for a spell. Neighbors who'd once waved stopped. The minister who used to preach about charity gave a sermon on public decency that was carefully indirect. My badge felt like an emblem of war rather than service. But Lena's pieces started to peel paint off the facade. She ran a 3-part series: skeleton accounts, shell companies named after family pets, and a human map of the corruption. So many stories from so many people came forward once they smelled blood in the water. Women who'd had loans vanish, widowers whose properties had changed custody, a business owner whose life savings were misapplied. The ledger was the spark. People's voices were the fuel. That's when they hit back. Dean filed a defamation suit. Messages appeared online suggesting I'd coerced witnesses. A sheriff's deputy I used to work with approached me like a man balancing his pension on a kitchen scale. "Ruth, you're making this personal," he said. "You're putting careers at risk." I looked at him and said, "I put my daughter's life at risk," I answered. Then I walked away. After the first series, Lena pushed for arrests. Jack and his federal contacts opened a quiet probe that couldn't be swatted easily. They got warrants for bank accounts, and for once the paper tiger roared. A whole slew of men thought their names were inviolable, until wire transfers bounced back flagged for investigation. It was messy, and it was law-affiliated, and the man in the Marshall house was suddenly a different creature when his assets were clipped. They tried to discredit me by digging up old complaints I'd filed as a cop, where men bitter about tickets had filed counter-complaints. They found nothing but ordinary mistakes. The DA's old allies painted the mistakes as symptoms of an unstable mind. The newspapers printed both sides. The town split. People who used to nod over fences started glancing with judgment. Some restaurants turned away patrons when my face or Lena's byline was mentioned. My husband found his friends quieter. My sister avoided my calls after a piece came out implying I'd bent procedure. They didn't say it, but the implication was clear. I was a crusader gone rogue. I kept pushing. I needed one more lever. Dean's Achilles' heel was always his need for control and for a publicly clean reputation. He'd bought influence in public charities and funded pet projects. He wanted to be seen as a giver. That gave me a place to hit him. The donors. I began quietly calling contributors, asking simple questions about receipts and the destination of certain funds. Old donors, fat in their complacency, were embarrassed to be named in a scandal. That embarrassment makes people defensive and then cooperative. Suddenly, a man who once held power at luncheons found himself explaining transactions to his accountant and then to federal investigators. While I did this, I kept Olivia close. She didn't want to leave town. There were practicalities, a job, a case she was handling. But after a night in my house where the walls felt safe and normal, she started sleeping better. She said once, voice small, "You didn't tell me you'd be like this." I said nothing. Some things you don't explain until they're done. Escalation came quick. This is how corruption works. When you start to choke a body's arteries, the body lashes out. They tried to push my daughter into taking a plea for embezzlement. They threatened to tie her up in civil suits until she was bankrupt. They paid off a small-time journalist to run a hit piece questioning her ethics. Someone broke into my car and threw a rock through the windshield, the glass spidering like a warning. I filed the report and they closed it as vandalism. The point wasn't the report, it was the fear. Fear buys silence. Fear keeps wounds small. But fear closes down when it gets answers. So I kept giving answers. Sometimes legal, sometimes not. I wanted to hurt, but I didn't want to become the exact thing that used trauma as leverage. I wanted them exposed, not erased. I wanted the law to do the heavy lifting. That's why the moment we had a warrant for Dean's accounts, I fed it to Jack and Lena at the same time. I watched the town see its Golden Boys transactions go up on a screen at a public hearing. People gasped when they saw the money move, and that gasp turned into a chorus. People remembered where they'd seen Dean smiling at ribbon cuttings and suddenly tied that image to missing pensions and vanished trusts. The court of public opinion is loud in small towns. It rattles walls. They didn't take it sitting down. A man like Dean calls favors, and he calls them loudly. The judge who initially signed my restraining order resigned under pressure. It later came out he'd received a contribution through one of Dean's charities. Owen disappeared. He left his badge in a locker and joined a private security firm overseas. The audit of M&R Holdings ran for months. When the first indictments came, they were for fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud, not for the physical violence Dean had made a habit of. There wasn't always a paper trail for that, but the fraud indictments were enough. Garnishments, asset freezes, a jury that finally heard the ledgers we'd pieced together in the dark. I stood in the courtroom the first day and watched him sit there, immaculate suit, the same smile now worn thin. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he'd ask for mercy or speak to his daughter. But he sat silent. The trial lasted months, testimony after testimony revealing the quiet, ugly work of a crooked system. Witnesses who'd been paid suddenly found their courage when subpoenas arrived. Documents turned up where people had sworn they hadn't existed. Money, it turned out, is slippery, but not untraceable when enough light hits it. There's a misconception that going rogue is a simple thrill, that you stand outside the law and become untouchable. That's not true. Going rogue buys you time and makes you enemies, but it also forces you to be creative. When political pressure mounted to shut Lena down, when the DA's office tried to seize the evidence as tainted, I produced a chain of custody I'd built on my own. Careful notes, witness statements, a recorded interview with Dean's bookkeeper who finally cracked. I don't pretend it was clean. None of it was. It was jagged and ugly and illegal in parts. But in the courtroom, the prosecutor used the pieces that were admissible, and the jury didn't need the rest. They needed to see that the pattern existed, and patterns can be proven. At the end, when the verdict came in, I watched the courtroom and felt the same hollow that had lived in me since the first bruise. People clapped, some cried, but the applause didn't fill the hollow. It tightened it. Justice had a price. People had been ruined to make the proof possible. But for Olivia, for her safety, for the record that would follow her the rest of her life, the verdict mattered. He was found guilty, sentenced, assets frozen, deputies implicated removed. It didn't bring back what he'd taken, but it bought a breathing space we hadn't had. I walked out of the courthouse and the wind hit me like someone had opened a door. Lena was there, camera out but a smile that wasn't triumphant. "You did it," she said. "You did what you had to." I didn't answer because I knew the truth. I had torn my life into pieces to rebuild a different map. Some of those pieces couldn't be repaired. We won the case, but I never told you about the nights I sat in the dark and imagined a different win. A world without the ledger, without the compromises that let men like Dean breed. That's not how it ends in reality. It ends with a sentence and a list of names, and a column of figures in a ledger, and a daughter sleeping without a bruise on her face. It ends with the knowledge that this kind of corruption will, if it can, begin again. You contain it until you can't, or you fight until you can. I fought. I broke rules I couldn't put on the stand. I bent things that would have tied the prosecutor's hands if they'd known. But the guilty verdict reads the same way whether you took the long route or the short one. The difference is in what you sleep on at night. I slept on the couch next to Olivia's hospital bed for weeks. Sometimes she woke and said my name like a prayer, and I answered like one. That's all a mother gets sometimes. The small reclaiming of a life piece by piece. You asked for a vengeance story. You got one in the civic sense. Law came down. Men who thought a badge was only ornamental learned otherwise. But there's a cost. I will never tell you going rogue was clean. I will tell you it was necessary for the child who relied on me. I will tell you the ledger was burned in the trial's closing statements, and the smell of it lingered for months. When it was over, we didn't sing. We drank coffee in the kitchen and watched the rain. The Marshall name was a whisper now in the town's corridors. People who'd once smiled at Dean's luxury began to look at their own ledgers. Change was incremental. It rarely looks cinematic. It looks like paperwork being refiled. Like a deputy losing his badge. Like a judge who finally, slowly, has to answer for how he got paid. That's the part the movies don't show. There are nights I still imagine him in the dark, plotting another way. Men like that don't disappear, but the law can hold them back for a while. It can make it harder. That, in itself, is a small grace. Olivia moved away a year later. She took a job in a city where the air didn't echo Dean's name. We still talk every week, and she calls herself lucky. I tell her the truth. Luck had little to do with it. It was effort and ugliness, and the kind of stubbornness that grinds down even the sharpest tools. If you're listening, if you're mad and you're aching and you think the badge is just metal, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's far more. It's a promise to do whatever it takes, within the last breath you have, before it's too late. I kept part of that promise. I lost a lot to keep it. But my daughter lives to make her own choices. That, finally, is justice enough.